So this is screencast 2 on attending behaviour. I'm picking up on, we've just been talking about verbal and non-verbal communication and minimal encourages. And we're moving on to talk about something called verbal following or restatement. And this is a really important skill, but one that people often find quite difficult because they often feel they are interrupting people. But this is about responding to things that the client or service user is saying. And it really helps you to stay engaged in their story, following their path. So it's allowing them to lead you. And what you would do if you are verbal following is listen to what people are saying and select words that are key things and repeat them back to them. So if they've just told you, actually, I'm really struggling at the moment, my appetite's really poor, I know I need to eat more, but I am really finding it difficult. You could have picked up on words like struggling, no appetite, or, alternatively, with someone who's eating more because they are distressed, you eat more when you're stressed. So you're just picking out those words. But what you are trying to do is say them quite quietly so that they don't interrupt, but the person you're talking with hears them and is able to think, yes, they heard that, but they're still carrying on. So it's a kind of quiet, lower tone, tentative repeating of a word that they have used. So it can be a single word, like struggling, or a short phrase, you eat more when you're stressed. So it's using that short phrase of their own words. You're not trying to interpret it. You're literally staying on their path, staying with where they are and what they have said. Really shows people that you've listened and heard them. You can use it as a question. So you're struggling with nausea. How you say it can sound more like a question. The whole idea is to encourage the patient to keep talking, say more. And really at this beginning bit of a consultation, perhaps when someone has been admitted to hospital or you're seeing them in an outpatient setting, what's led up to the appointment. And so they may tell you a little bit about their story, and you can show you are listening by picking out words in that story. So trying to understand their journey, but also make sure they know you've understood by giving it back to them. And if you don't know what to say, don't know what your next question should be, verbal following helps you to keep the service user talking. So moving on to questions, and of course this is going to be a big part of your typical day. And questions are normal, aren't they? We all ask questions, and they convey lots of different things. And of course you can't do your job without asking questions. So we need to find out about people in order to complete our assessment. The key thing is about using the right question at the right time and not using more questions than you need to. But questions, help us understand things better, help the clients understand themselves better sometimes, and they demonstrate interest in people. What we need to be mindful of is the first words of those questions often influence response. So, whether we're using, why, how, when, what, where, when, could, using the right question at the right time is a skill that we want to develop. So that's our key thing in person-centered care, is making sure we're using the right questions at the right time. Because if we don't, what we can do is make the service user feel they are being interrogated, or that they can only tell you an answer to your question. So it's very much on your path as opposed to on theirs. So we've really got to be mindful of that. And also some words really can add to that feeling of interrogation and add to a feeling of judgment. So if you're going, so why did you do that? that kind of says, well, I shouldn't have done that. Why don't you eat breakfast? Should I not? Oh, I know I should eat breakfast. And you can create a kind of feeling of guilt or being judged in the patient, and we really don't want to do that. So the other thing to think about with questions is the timing of them. So we need to allow people to tell their stories. And if we start asking questions too much, we can really interfere with our relationship with the patient, with developing rapport and trust. So it can be really damaging to ask too many questions too soon. And even if you've built rapport with somebody, if you then go on to start ask lots of questions without permission or consent, you lose that rapport. So questions are often the things that can create a breakdown in our communication with service users. So I say they can feel interrogated, they can feel uncomfortable, can become very defensive, and sometimes angry. And what we don't want when we are doing our typical day is someone feeling defensive, because then what you get told in that typical day may actually be what they think you want to hear rather than what is actually the truth. And we have to remember that food intake is a very personal thing. It's often tied up with culture and faith and habit, and sometimes with guilt, depending on the situation with the individual. We ask a lot of personal questions as well, and you will go on to be asking much more broadly about lifestyle, asking about physical activity levels, whether people smoke, how much alcohol they consume, their bowel function, relationships, who they live with. And it's a very detailed account that we're trying to get from a person about who they are, and what makes them tick and what's important to them. So just ask yourself that question. How do I feel when someone asks me all the detail about those things? We have to create the environment where people are happy to talk to us about those things, rather than having an environment where people feel they're on the defensive. So if we ask too many questions too soon, we can end up making people not really want to share anything with us. And I'm sure you're all very used to the terms closed and open questions, but I'm going to go over it anyway because I want us to apply it to our dietetic situations. So closed questions, we're often getting a short response, and we're asking a one word answer, yes or no, or a number, how many pieces of fruit do you have a day? 3. So we might be asking that kind of closed questions. How many sugars do you have in your tea? But they get very limited information. So you might find out how many sugars that people have in their tea, but it doesn't tell you how many they have in coffee. So we're very much getting a bit of information that we want for our agenda. It's very much focused on what we want to know. And that means you can actually go through asking about breakfast, and you have asked about 20 questions and not got any further than breakfast, because you've asked what cereal you have, how much of it you have, do you add milk to it, what type of milk is it, do you add any sugar to it or anything else? Do you have anything else? Or you have toast, what kind of bread's that? Do you have butter on it? Or do you have anything else on it? What type of margarine? And you go on and you get lots and lots of questions to get even past breakfast. And that can make it very difficult for people. There are good times to use closed questions. Of course, we do need sometimes to know the detail. So we may want to ask some points of clarity. And there are some people for whom it's better. Talking to perhaps with someone with learning disability, they want short, clear questions. And sometimes when people have speech difficulties, somebody's had a stroke, for example, it's easier if we can give them questions that might have a yes or a no, or a number, just to make it easier for them if they're still struggling with speech. So if we do need, and if we really need that information, such as frequency, portion size, or type of milk, okay, then it's worth asking that question and using closed questions. But remember that it's very much on our own agenda. And I would ask you, with your typical day, how much detail do you need for that specific situation? Do we really need to know if someone takes sugar in their tea if they have celiac disease? Not really. But if we're trying to look at someone with diabetes or cardiovascular disease who needs to manage their weight, or we want them to put weight on, and therefore actually having a bit more sugar may be helpful, then that can be really useful. So wherever possible, we need to be using open questions. And these are questions that allow people to talk. And the ideal time initially is asking people, what's led up to their hospital admission or their appointment, just to get a bit of the context of what we're talking about. And if we do that well, people will often give us quite a lot of information without us asking more questions. So we get the story from their perspective without lots of interruptions. And this way your verbal following really fits in well. But we could get people to tell us more about what's been happening. Could you give me a little bit more detail about that? Could you explain? So we're asking people, yeah, actually, we want more information. Please do continue. And with our typical day, could you tell me where food fits into your day? If we do that, we get the social around it, we get the work, we get the other things that might be going on. The fact that they're managing 3 children at home on their own because their husband works away, or whatever it is, whatever that scenario is. So we get a lot more information about the social and psychological aspects of someone's life if we ask more open questions. So you'll notice here we've got more what, and where would that fit in? How would you go about that? What's important to you about that? And getting people to tell us a little bit more about what's going on for them. And sometimes you will pick up things that are barriers to change in that. Sometimes we may find concerns for people. We understand a lot more about what's going on for them. So I would encourage you to use open questions as much as possible. When we think of our typical day, that's going to be asking people, could you tell me what you eat and drink? Perhaps starting at the beginning of the day and going through. And then asking permission for a few more of those closed questions or a little bit more information. Could you tell me, is it any different at weekends? Or how would it be different? So you're getting people to tell you the story without you having to ask so many questions. So we need both questions. We need closed and open, but we are going to need to be encouraging more open questions because the patient should be talking as much as we are. It should be a balanced conversation rather than it feeling like an interrogation, which you can do if you ask lots of closed questions. So as we go through our workshops, we are going to be trying to use more open questions, use more of our minimal encourages and our verbal following to enable the patient to keep talking and to tell us more.